Annabel looked over her shoulder at the dust cloud rising behind her. Somewhere in that haze was a man who called himself her husband, his heart as cold as any gunslinger's barrel. She had journeyed across half the country to meet him, only to find her future weighed down by cruelty. Now, with trembling hands, clutching the reins of a borrowed horse, she braved the rugged pass leading into the towering mountains. Nightfall was coming, and with it the promise of peril. But Annabel had something her husband did not, the raw determination to survive, and the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might help her. Annabel Harrington never imagined her life would end up on a dusty train platform in the middle of Wyoming territory. At 20 years of age, she possessed a bright curiosity and a hopeful heart, tempered by the reality of losing her parents to a fever that swept through her Pennsylvania hometown. With no close kin left to rely upon, and no inheritance beyond a few trinkets and a battered family Bible, she had decided to place her faith in a mail-order advertisement that promised marriage security and a home. She vividly remembered first reading the letter. It had been penned in a firm, precise hand. Tobias Whitfield, a rancher near Fort Laramie, seeking a respectable wife with whom to build a bright future. He described his holdings a stretch of fertile land by a creek, a comfortable cabin, a stable of good horses. He spoke of sunsets over rolling plains, and a hope that with the right woman at his side, he would expand his ranch into the finest in the territory. For a young lady with nowhere else to turn, it sounded like a dream. So with trembling hope in her heart, Annabel packed what little she possessed into a single trunk. She boarded a train heading west, then changed to a bumpy stagecoach that left her dazed but determined to make this new life work. She tried to drown out the quiet voice of doubt, whispering that she was too quick to trust a stranger's promises. Everyone on the stagecoach, hard-eyed prospectors, weary travelers, anxious mothers with fussing children, seemed to be running toward something or away from something else. That alone made her feel less lonely. The final stagecoach stop deposited her amid swirling dust and battered storefronts at a small outpost near Fort Laramie. Nervousness prickled up her spine as she looked around, scanning every face for signs of recognition. Then a man stepped forward with a confident stride, tall, lean, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that cast a sharp shadow over his features. "Tobias Whitfield?" she asked timidly. He nodded. "You're Annabel." Her heart pounded in relief. He had shown up just as promised, and she offered a polite smile. Tobias offered to carry her trunk. Though he was not unhandsome, there was a certain hardness around his eyes, a calculation in the way he surveyed her. But Annabel, dizzy from the journey and the swirl of emotion, chose hope over caution and climbed into his buckboard. As they rode off toward his ranch, the dusty horizon spread out on all sides, a vast ocean of sagebrush and rolling hills. She tried making small talk, but Tobias responded with curt nods and an occasional question about her upbringing. Though she found his answers short, she attributed it to frontier reticence. Men out here often had little need for polite conversation. It was only later that she would recall how in those first few miles, an unsettling chill had settled in her bones, one that had nothing to do with the wind. Tobias's ranch sat off the main trail, nestled against a narrow creek fed by snowmelt from distant mountains. The land was indeed spacious. Annabel was impressed by the sturdy fences, the neat rows of stacked hay, and a barn that looked newly built. The main cabin, while not large, was clean on the outside. A single window let in the late afternoon sun, and a porch afforded a view of the plains. They dismounted. Tobias led her inside, showing her a simple interior, a pot-bellied stove for heat, a few chairs around a wooden table, and a bedroom in the back. The walls were plain logs, the floor rough-hewn planks. It was no palace, but to Annabel's weary eyes, it could have been a paradise if inhabited by kindness and love. Within the week they married at a small chapel near Fort Laramie. The ceremony was attended by a handful of curious townsfolk and travellers with nothing better to do. It was quick officiated by a circuit-riding preacher who hardly asked questions. Annabel recalled the final vow she spoke, her voice faltering slightly, and the coarse grip of Tobias's hand around hers. Back at the ranch, she set about her wifely tasks as best she could. She cooked simple meals, tidied the cabin, and tried to add small touches of warmth, fresh flowers on the windowsill, a clean cloth draped over the rough wooden table. She even sewed curtains from fabric she had brought with her. Tobias seemed to approve silently, but offered few words of thanks. Despite her attempts to please him, an invisible wall lingered between them. He had a temper. She saw flashes of it when a horse refused to follow a lead, or when a farmhand made a clumsy mistake. A snarl of curses would pour from his mouth, causing Annabel's stomach to twist with apprehension. He never directed that rage explicitly toward her, at least not at first. But it hovered like a storm cloud, ready to strike with thunder and lightning at any provocation. Annabel told herself that all marriages took time. After all, he worked long hours, faced financial worries, and carried the stress of ranching on his shoulders. She was determined to be patient, to give love, and not lose hope. Whenever she felt lonely, she'd remind herself that she was forging a new path, that the wide sky overhead and the crisp western air, though harsh at times, offered a chance for independence she might never have found. Back east one evening, after Tobias returned from a day in town, Annabel noticed his eyes were glazed with whiskey. He was more sullen than usual, pacing about the cabin, complaining about the merchant overcharging him and the rising costs of feed. She tried to console him with a warm meal, but he shoved the plate aside, toppling a glass of water. Tobias glared at her. "You think I don't see you looking at me like I'm some worthless fool?" He spat, his voice wavering between anger and self-pity. "I don't think you're worthless." Annabel protested softly. I'm just worried. You seem troubled." Troubled, Tobias's face twisted. "You have no idea what trouble is." And with that, he snatched her by the wrist. His grip tightened until she gasped in pain. In that moment, she saw the cruelty stripped of all pretense. His was not merely a sour temperament. There was a darkness, a resentment that went deep. It seemed to lash out at anyone who dared question him or show the slightest weakness. She wrested her arm away, massaging the bruising that soon appeared. Though rattled, she tried to calm him, to steady him toward sleep. He finally sank into a rocking chair, muttering bitter curses until he drifted into a drunken doze. Annabel, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, realized that her dream of a loving marriage was dangerously fragile. Over the next few months, the darkness emerged more often. It manifested in random acts of belittlement, smashing a plate if dinner was late, or storming off in a huff if the weather turned and he lost half a day's work. He never seemed satisfied, no matter how carefully Annabel tried to meet his needs. And though she saw him attempt to rein in his anger in front of ranch hands, he never bothered to hold back with her. More than once, she found herself cornered by his venomous words, forced to watch him fling a fist against the wall. She prayed that the violence would not turn directly on her, but a creeping dread told her that it might be only a matter of time. All illusions that she might fix him or soothe his rage evaporated when she overheard him arguing with a passing traveler, a drifter who'd asked for water, Tobias had refused, mocking the man for his worn clothes and battered hat, practically spitting on the ground where he stood. When the traveler turned away with a shrug, Tobias pulled out his revolver and fired a shot into the air. The traveler dashed off. Tobias laughed cruelly and slammed the door, satisfied that he had shown who's in charge around here. That night, as Annabel cowered in bed, she felt the dull weight of fear pressing on her chest. She needed to leave. She had to save herself. But where could she go? She was hundreds of miles from her hometown, with no money, no friends to take her in. Every path out seemed fraught with peril, yet as a bruise on her forearm, testifying to Tobias's growing brutality, throbbed beneath her sleeve, she knew that to remain would mean losing every shred of hope she had left. Opportunity came in the form of a ranch hand named Samuel Cooper, an older man who'd spent years wandering from place to place, taking seasonal work where he could find it. He had gentle eyes and a measured way of speaking. Noticing Annabel's bruises and the shadows in her expression, he pressed a small envelope into her hand, one afternoon when Tobias was away. Inside was a brief note. "I see you're in trouble. If you need help, meet me at the barn after dark." Annabel's heart pounded as she considered the consequences of trusting a near stranger. But the alternative, remaining alone in her misery, seemed more frightening by the day. So that night, after Tobias collapsed, in another drunken stupor, Annabel slipped from the cabin to the barn, her footsteps light across the dirt yard. Samuel was waiting there, oil lantern in hand. He told her in hushed tones that he had witnessed enough cruelty in his life to know it never got better without intervention or escape. He offered to help Annabel leave to hide her from Tobias until she could get to a larger town. He had connections in the area. He believed he could arrange safe passage to Cheyenne, where she could board a train and vanish into anonymity. Annabel, tears shimmering in her eyes, thanked him. "I don't know what to say. I never wanted to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Samuel said kindly. "You're a human being. Nobody deserves what Tobias is doing." They quickly hashed out a plan. Samuel would gather supplies in secret, a horse food for the journey, and what little money he had. He warned Annabel that she needed to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. Tobias's mood was unpredictable, and the safest time to run was when he left for business in town. As they finished speaking, a soft sound from outside startled them. They fell silent, hearts pounding, but it turned out to be a stray cat slinking across the yard. Nevertheless, fear thrummed in Annabel's veins. She realized that any misstep could lead Tobias to discover their betrayal, a discovery that would almost certainly end in violence. From that night onward, she feigned normalcy around Tobias, tending the cabin and cooking meals, even offering forced smiles when he was in a mood to demand them. Meanwhile, Samuel discreetly bundled supplies and stowed them in a hidden corner of the barn. A tense week crawled by. Each day Annabel feared that Tobias might notice her trembling or the covert glances she exchanged with Samuel. Then came a morning when Tobias announced he'd be riding to Fort Laramie and might not return until late. It was now or never. Samuel saddled a sturdy mare in the barn. He handed Annabel a small bag of provisions, dried jerky biscuits, a canteen of water, and a meager stash of coins. "Ride north," he whispered. "There's a trail through the foothills that leads to a pass in the mountains. Once you cross into the territory beyond, keep going until you reach the next settlement. Stay off the main roads. With luck, Tobias won't figure out which way you went. I'll do what I can to delay him." Their plans were set with quivering lips. Annabel thanked Samuel again. She mounted the horse, heart hammering. The man offered a last bit of advice. Listen, the mountains can be dangerous this time of year. Weather can turn fast. But if you keep your wits about you, you'll get through. Just don't lose hope. Annabel set off the early morning sun, gilding the prairie grasses. She rode at a brisk trot, anxious to put distance between herself and Tobias's ranch. The wind on her face tasted like freedom, tempered by the sour tang of fear in her throat. Every step took her farther into a wilderness she'd never traversed, yet she told herself that the unknown was far better than certain torment. The first few hours passed smoothly. She found the trail. Samuel had mentioned a faint path, heading into rolling hills. Occasional stands of pine and juniper offered shade. She paused once to drink from her canteen and found her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She took a moment to steady herself, breathing in the vast emptiness around her. With no one in sight, she could almost believe she was safe. Late in the day, she came upon a narrow ravine. Carefully, she guided the mare down one side and up the other. The going was slow, and by the time she reached more level ground, the sky threatened twilight. Dark clouds loomed over distant peaks, hinting at an approaching storm. She needed shelter. Spotting a rocky overhang, she decided to make camp. She tethered the horse to a scraggly pine, fed her a small portion of oats, then settled down with her bedroll on a patch of relatively flat ground. Hunger gnawed at her, but she made do with a piece of jerky. As the wind picked up and raindrops began to patter, she slipped under the overhang, curling into herself for warmth. She did not sleep well. Every crack of thunder or rustle of brush had her heart pounding, imagining Tobias on her trail. She prayed that Samuel's efforts to mislead him would work. Yet she knew Tobias was cunning, and that the rage fueling him might drive him to track her relentlessly. She shivered through the night, her dreams haunted by visions of him looming out of the darkness. Morning arrived in a dreary drizzle. She ate a small breakfast of biscuit and water, then pressed on. The trail grew steeper, winding up into higher elevations. Gusts of wind tugged at her skirt. The mountains rose around her like silent sentinels, their slopes draped in pine forests and sheer rock faces. The mare snorted in unease when loose stones clattered underfoot. By midday, the drizzle intensified into a freezing rain. Her fingers went numb on the reins. Worse still, the path seemed to split with one branch heading east and the other continuing north. Samuel's instructions had been vague on this section, and Annabel hesitated, uncertain which route to take. She chose the northern trail, hoping it would eventually descend into friendlier terrain. She soon regretted her choice. The path narrowed to a goat track along a sheer drop. Loose gravel made footing perilous, and the mare whinnied in protest. Each step felt like a gamble. The wind howled, flinging stinging droplets of rain into Annabel's face. She could barely see more than a few yards ahead. Suddenly, a sharp clap of thunder spooked the mare. The horse reared, nearly toppling backwards. Annabel fought desperately to keep her balance. The horse stumbled, sending a shower of pebbles off the cliff. A horrifying moment passed as Annabel felt the mare's hind legs sliding. She leaned forward, heart hammering, urging the horse away from the edge. By some miracle, the mare managed to regain footing. They pressed on each step, an act of desperate caution. When at last the path widened, Annabel felt relief wash over her like a warm tide. But it was short-lived. For ahead, rising from a depression in the mountainside, she saw a small campsite with the remains of a fire. Someone had been there recently. She could see fresh footprints in the mud. Her heart seized. Could it be Tobias or one of his hired hands? Panic flared. She scanned the area but saw no one. The day was waning, leaving her torn between forging onward and risking an after-dark ride on treacherous paths, or taking advantage of the pre-built campsite in hopes that whoever used it was long gone. Exhaustion made the decision for her. She knew she couldn't push the horse much farther without rest. She tethered the mare under a makeshift lean-to, planning to stay alert through the night in case the campsite's previous occupant returned. That night she huddled by the cold fire pit, her body racked with shivers. The storm's fury had eased somewhat, but the chill mountain air seeped through her thin clothes. Sleep came in fitful snatches, once she awoke to the distant howl of a coyote. Or was it something else? Annabelle discovered the answer the next morning, when she heard a distant shout. Startled from a half-sleep, she scrambled upright and peered through the trees. 3 horsemen were emerging from a grove of pines, heading straight for the campsite. Her blood ran cold when she recognized Tobias, leading the group face set in a grim mask. The other 2 men must have been ranch hands or hired trackers. She had no time to saddle her mare properly. She grabbed her bag, stuffed it under her arm, and practically vaulted onto the horse. In a flurry of hooves, she charged up the slope behind the campsite, hoping to lose herself in the maze of pines. A gunshot cracked the air. Bark splintered off a nearby tree. She spurred the mare onward, branches clawing at her face and skirt. Below, she heard Tobias's furious curses. He was close enough that she could taste the malice in his voice. For a harrowing stretch, the chase was relentless. The terrain was rough, and her horse was already tired from the previous days of hard riding. She stumbled upon boulder-strewn hollows, muddy creek beds, and steep inclines that forced her to slow. Each time she paused, the pounding of hooves behind her drew nearer. Annabelle's heart pounded in her throat. Desperation lent her strength. She refused to be taken back to that wretched cabin. She refused to endure the brutality of a man who cared nothing for her well-being. So she pressed on, weaving through pine thickets and across ridges in a mad attempt to lose her pursuers. At last she reached a clearing at the crest of a ridge. The ground sloped away toward a valley, dark green with coniferous forests. Far off to the west rose jagged peaks that glowed in the midday sun. Hoping that the valley would provide cover, she guided the horse downward. The going was treacherous, but at least the terrain might slow Tobias and his men as well. When she reached the bottom, a swift mountain stream blocked her path. With no time to search for a proper ford, she urged the mare into the cold, rushing water. Icy currents swirled around her legs, sending a wave of numbness through her body. The horse stumbled on the slick stones, but managed to fight the current and emerge on the far side. Annabelle glanced back, stomach twisting at the sight of movement near the ridge's crest. They were still coming. She pressed deeper into the valley, forging a path through thick underbrush. Here the sun barely penetrated, and the hush of the forest pressed in around her. She heard only her own ragged breathing and the soft clop of the mare's hooves. Several times she paused to listen, but the forest gave no clue as to whether Tobias and his men had followed her directly. After an hour of cautious progress, she came upon a small clearing strewn with stumps and fallen logs, evidence of old logging activity. On the far side was a narrow, faint trail. She guided her mare toward it, passing among tall pines that towered overhead. That was when the next shot rang out. A bullet whined off a rock near her foot. The horse reared again, nearly throwing her. Annabelle yanked the reins, heart pounding. Through the trees behind her, she caught a glimpse of Tobias. His revolver raised, hatred etched onto his face like a permanent scar. She dug her heels into the mare's flanks. They surged forward, but she could hear the thunder of hooves behind her. Fear clawed at her soul. Branches whipped her cheeks, drawing blood. She clung low to the horse's neck, ignoring the biting pain. The trail twisted, forcing her to slow, lest she break the mare's leg on a hidden root or stone. Another gunshot echoed this time. She felt a hot rush of pain graze her upper arm. A startled cry escaped her lips. She pressed a hand to the wound, blood seeping through her sleeve. Pain searing her arm. Annabelle fought to stay conscious. She realized that if she continued on this narrow path, Tobias would corner her. She needed to break away, somehow find a spot to hide or an escape route only passable on foot. Summoning her last reserves of strength, she maneuvered the mare off the trail and into the dense undergrowth. The horse stumbled and nearly fell, but managed to keep going. Low-hanging branches tore at them, but at last they emerged into another ravine. Here the ground was so rocky and uneven that the mare could barely pick her way forward. Annabelle dismounted to lead the animal on foot, glancing back every few moments to see if Tobias had followed. Her blood dripped onto the stones from her throbbing arm. She was losing strength. She had no time to fashion a proper bandage, but she pressed a cloth from her bag against the wound, praying it would stem the bleeding. At a bend in the ravine, the mare balked, refusing to go farther. Annabelle realized why a sheer rock face rose before them, at least 10 feet high, blocking any easy passage. There was no choice but to climb it. She cast about and found a precarious ledge that slanted up one side. She tethered the mare to a sapling, knowing the horse couldn't make the climb. This might be their parting. Tears stung her eyes at the thought of leaving the faithful animal, but survival demanded it. Steeling herself, she began to scramble up the ledge, using handholds in the rock. She gritted her teeth at the pain radiating from her upper arm. Loose stones clattered down, threatening to shatter her precarious grip. By the time she hauled herself onto the top of the ridge, her vision swam and her breath came in ragged gasps. She lay there for a moment, pressing a trembling hand to her wound. Then faintly, she heard voices echo in the ravine below. "She can't have gone far," said Tobias. Annabelle dragged herself to her feet, staggering deeper into the forest beyond. She prayed that the thick canopy and the labyrinth of rocky outcrops would conceal her. Each step felt heavier than the last, her blood leaving a faint trail on the moss and fallen pine needles. Still, she trudged on, forced by fear to ignore her pain. She wasn't sure how long she walked. Hours, perhaps. The forest seemed endless, the slanting sunlight hinting at late afternoon. Her body was racked with chills, both from blood loss and the dropping temperature. Stumbling into a small clearing, she collapsed against a tree trunk. A wave of dizziness overcame her. Through half-lidded eyes, she saw flickers of movement in the underbrush. Was it a deer? A cougar? As darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, she made out the figure of a man stepping cautiously into the clearing. He was tall, with coppery skin and dark hair, plaited into 2 braids. He wore clothing that marked him as a member of the Sioux moccasins, leggings and a leather shirt adorned with beads. She mustered the last of her strength to raise her head. Part of her expected another gunshot or some new terror, but the man merely approached with quiet steps, his gaze intent on her wound. She whispered something, she wasn't even sure what. And then the world spun into blackness. When Annabelle awoke, she was lying under a makeshift shelter of branches and animal skins. She felt a damp cloth on her forehead, and her wounded arm was wrapped in clean bandages. A small fire crackled nearby, its warmth soothing her chilled bones. Sitting by the fire was the Sioux man who had found her, his dark eyes watching her carefully. She tried to speak, but her throat felt raw and dry. He offered her a wooden cup. The liquid inside tasted bitter, but it eased her parched mouth. She managed to croak out a thank you. He nodded, acknowledging her words without speaking. Then he pointed to her bandage, speaking softly in his own tongue and miming the action of caution, as if telling her to stay still. Over the next few hours he tended to her, changing her bandage, offering sips of the bitter tea. She realized with a mixture of awe and relief that he was saving her life. If he had left her in the woods or ignored her plight, she would likely have bled out or succumbed to fever. She tried to convey her gratitude in halting words. "Thank you," she repeated, voice trembling. "My name is Annabel." She touched her chest. "Annabel." He inclined his head, then pointed to himself. "Chayton," he said. His voice was low, but gentle. A day passed in relative quiet. Chayton hunted or gathered while she rested. He showed her how to make a poultice from local herbs to help her wound heal faster. He spoke occasionally in a mixture of basic English and his native language, and though communication was limited, his compassion shone through. Annabel told him a little about why she was fleeing her cruel husband, the chase through the mountains. Her voice shook with residual terror as she described Tobias's obsession. She wasn't certain how much Chayton understood, but he nodded gravely. She sensed he grasped the danger she was in, even if the details were murky. On the second night in his care, she heard voices echoing in the forest, speaking in harsh tones. She recognized Tobias's bark among them. Heart pounding, she struggled to sit up, panic constricting her chest. Chayton placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, indicating she should remain silent. He slipped out of the shelter, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The voices eventually faded. Annabel bit her lip until she tasted blood, fearing that at any moment Tobias might burst into the clearing with guns blazing. But all remained quiet until Chayton returned his expression. "Solemn, they are close," he said in halting English. "You must move soon." Annabel's eyes welled with tears. "I can't go far with this wound," she said, "but I can't stay either." Chayton nodded his gaze, resolute. "I will help." Early the next morning, Chayton guided Annabel out of the makeshift camp. He had fashioned a crude sling for her arm, supporting her injury. Leading a gentle pony perhaps caught and tamed by members of his tribe, he helped her mount. Though every jolt sent pain shooting up her arm, she knew that riding was faster than trying to walk in her weakened condition. They traveled along hidden trails that snaked through the forest, avoiding open areas. Occasionally, Chayton paused to scout ahead, ensuring they weren't walking into an ambush. Each time, Annabel's nerves churned with fear. Yet seeing how skillfully Chayton moved silent as a shadow among the pines gave her a shard of confidence. At midday, they paused by a creek so the pony could drink. Annabel tried to numb the fire in her wound by dipping her bandaged arm in the cold water. Chayton insisted on checking the bandages, reapplying the herbal salve. She asked him why he was helping her, a stranger from a world so different from his. He smiled softly, speaking in measured tones. "I have seen too much hurt," he said. "Too many people who are cruel. You are not cruel. You need help." Annabel found tears prickling at her eyes again. She realized that in just a few days he had shown her more kindness than Tobias ever had. His compassion felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They continued their journey through the afternoon, pushing deeper into the rugged mountains. Chayton seemed intent on leading her to some place of relative safety, perhaps a village or an encampment of his people. She was both hopeful and afraid. She had heard rumors that some settlers spread about the Sioux, that they were fierce warriors, unwelcoming to outsiders. But if Chaitin was any indication, those rumors were biased at best. Late that day, they came across a small plateau overlooking a vast expanse of pine forests and craggy peaks. In the far distance, Annabel could see a faint column of smoke rising from what might be a settlement or camp. Chaitin pointed toward it, nodding. "My people," he said. Then he frowned as if uncertain how they would receive her. Annabel swallowed hard. "Do you think they'll let me stay, just until I recover enough to leave these parts?" Chaitin looked at her with warm sympathy. "They trust me. We will see." Night fell before they could reach the camp, so they took shelter in a narrow pass, sheltered by overhanging rocks. Chaitin managed to start a small fire, carefully shielding the smoke so it wouldn't give away their location. He offered Annabel roasted strips of rabbit, which she ate hungrily. Weakness still clung to her limbs, but her spirit felt stronger, buoyed by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. However, a new worry nagged at her. Tobias wouldn't give up so easily. If he discovered Chaitin's involvement, would he lash out at the Sioux tribe as well? Her chest tightened at the thought. She wanted no more bloodshed, no more violence. Yet she also knew that if Tobias found her, he'd drag her back or kill her the trying. When they set off at dawn, Annabel noticed Chaitin's tension. He continually scanned the surroundings, as if expecting an attack at any moment. The air felt brittle with apprehension. The path wound down the side of a gorge, leading toward the smoke plume they had seen the day before. As they drew nearer, a series of low drums and voices drifted on the wind. Finally, they arrived at a broad clearing ringed by tall pines. Several teepees stood in a loose circle around a central fire pit. People moved about, tending to daily tasks, cooking, gathering wood, caring for children. At their appearance, the conversation quieted, and curious eyes turned their way. Chaitin raised a hand in greeting, addressing an older man who approached. The man's face was lined with years of experience, his gaze sharp and guarded. Chaitin spoke in his native tongue, gesturing occasionally to Annabel and her bandaged arm. The older man listened, then nodded curtly, signaling others to come help. Nervous, Annabel dismounted. A group of women approached gently, guiding her to a seat by the central fire. Despite the language barrier, they wore expressions of concern and compassion. One carefully unwrapped her bandage, grimacing at the sight of the angry red wound. Another rushed to fetch more healing herbs. Annabel tried to express her gratitude, her voice soft. "Thank you," she repeated. Her attempt at a grateful smile was met with understanding nods. She thought of her mother, who had always taught her to see the humanity in others, regardless of differences. That lesson resonated powerfully now. While the women tended to her injury, Chaitin and the older man, whom Annabel assumed was a respected leader, stepped away to converse. She caught snippets of their discussion, though most of it was in Sioux. She did, however, pick out the name Tobias as Chaitin explained her situation. The older man's expression darkened. For the next several days, Annabel remained in the camp, slowly regaining her strength. Though the pain in her arm lingered, the fever subsided, and color returned to her cheeks. She learned small words in Sioux from the women who cared for her, reciprocating by teaching them English words for simple items like water, fire. Hoarse laughter broke the language barrier when children crowded around, fascinated by her pale skin and the newness she represented. Yet beneath the sense of community, there was an undercurrent of urgency. The tribe was well aware that tensions with white settlers were high in the region. Fort Laramie was not far, and rumors of new gold strikes often brought droves of prospectors who cared little for the rights of indigenous people. Annabel's presence, while tolerated, thanks to Chaitan's word, was a reminder that the outside world was pressing in. Chaitan visited her each day, checking on her wound, practicing his English, and patiently answering her questions. She learned that he'd lost family members to conflicts with settlers, and that he had joined a small group determined to live peacefully in the mountains, away from the increasing strife of the plains. He carried sorrow behind his calm eyes, a sorrow Annabel understood all too well. One evening, a scout from the camp returned with dire news. A small group of armed men, likely Tobias and his hired help, had been spotted a day's ride away, combing through the valleys, asking questions about a missing woman. The men had threatened violence if the tribe refused to cooperate. Panic coursed through Annabel. She felt a crushing guilt that her presence might bring harm to these people who had saved her life. But the older man, whose name she learned was Matto, remained calm. He explained through Chaitan that they would not abandon her to the cruelty of these hunters. They would guide her to a safer place, deeper in the mountains where she could slip away. They decided to leave at first light, traveling in a small group, Chaitan, Annabel, and a few skilled hunters. The rest of the tribe would strike camp and move to a different location as well, not wanting conflict with armed strangers. Annabel saw how quickly they could disassemble their tipis and pack essential belongings. It was a testament to their resilience and nomadic traditions. At dawn, the group set out. Annabel, still weak, rode a sturdy pony provided by the tribe. Chaitan walked beside her, scanning the terrain while two hunters trailed behind. The plan was to escort her through a remote pass, out of Tobias's likely search range. Once there, she could descend into another valley and find passage to a safer town, or so they hoped. They traveled quietly for hours, winding through dense forests and across rocky ledges. The only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of hooves, the rustle of pines, and occasional murmured instructions. Annabel felt her heart lighten a little each time she glimpsed a hawk circling overhead, or a deer darting through the trees. Here, amid the raw beauty of the frontier, it was easy to forget the cruelty that had driven her to flee. Near midday they reached a narrow defile, a funnel-like gap in the mountains. A chill breeze swept through it, making Annabel shiver. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances. It was a natural choke point, an ideal spot for an ambush. Chaitan signaled for them to proceed with caution, scanning the ridgelines above. They were halfway through when a rifle shot rang out, cracking against the canyon walls like thunder. One of the hunters cried out and slumped, struck in the chest. Chaos erupted. Annabel's pony reared, nearly throwing her. A second shot ricocheted off the rocks near Chaitan. Up on the ridge, Tobias's men revealed themselves, rifles and revolvers in hand. Tobias stood at the center, a wicked grin twisting his features. "I knew you'd eventually come this way," he shouted, voice echoing eerily. "You can't hide from me." Annabel, the surviving Sioux hunter, swiftly returned fire with his bow, forcing Tobias and his men to duck behind rocks. Chaitan rushed to pull Annabel to cover behind a large boulder. Her injured arm throbbed painfully, but she tried to steady her nerves. She felt the old terror swirl inside her, threatening to overwhelm her. But she reminded herself that she had come too far, endured too much, to let Tobias break her. Now gunshots echoed back and forth. The terrain favored the ambushers. Tobias's men could pick targets from above. Yet Chaitan and the remaining hunter used the natural cover of rocks and ledges to counter. Annabel crouched low, fear constricting her throat. She hated feeling helpless, but her only weapon was a small knife Chaitan had given her. Her prayer was that none of her allies would lose their lives, protecting her. Amid the din of gunfire, she heard Tobias's voice. "Annabel," he hollered, "come out or I'll kill every one of these savages. You hear me? Get out here." Annabel clenched her jaw, tears pricking her eyes. She would not surrender to him, not after all the pain he'd caused, but the thought of more blood on her account weighed heavily. She looked at Chaitan, who shook his head firmly, indicating she should remain hidden. Then, with cunning speed, Chaitan signaled to the other hunter. They crept along the rock face, using the natural contours to climb higher. Annabel risked a glance and saw them vanish around a bend, presumably trying to flank Tobias's group. The gunfire from above intensified. Then suddenly, a scream tore through the air. One of Tobias's men tumbled down the slope arms, flailing. Annabel's heart leapt. Chaitan and the hunter had gained the upper hand, at least momentarily. Another shot rang out. She prayed they hadn't been hit. Then she heard Tobias's furious cursing, followed by a rush of footsteps. It sounded like the ambushers were being forced to retreat. Summoning her courage, Annabel rose enough to peer out from behind the boulder. She saw two men scrambling up the ridge, fear driving them to flee. Tobias remained behind his face, twisted with rage, firing blindly toward where Chaitan had disappeared. Annabel realized with a jolt that Tobias was now alone in the canyon, with her. She felt a surge of defiance. No more cowering, she told herself. Gripping the small knife in her good hand, she circled around the boulder. Tobias, reloading his revolver, spotted her movement and whirled. His eyes burned with hatred and triumph, as if to say, "Now I've got you, Annabel," he snarled. "You've led me a merry chase, but it ends here." She held her ground, though her heart pounded like a war drum. "You can't control me anymore, Tobias." She spat her voice, trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. He laughed darkly, pointing the revolver at her. "Oh, I can control you just fine. You're coming back with me, or dying here, makes no difference to me." Annabel refused to let him see her fear. She tightened her grip on the knife. "I won't go back," she said. Voice hoarse. She thought of all the abuse, all the nights cowering in dread, the wound on her arm, the bruise on her soul. "I'd rather die free than live as your slave." Tobias's sneer deepened. "Then die you shall." He pulled the trigger. A click misfire. Shock flickered in his eyes as he realized his gun had jammed. That split second was all Annabel needed. Summoning every ounce of courage, she rushed forward, stabbing wildly toward his chest. He sidestepped, but not quickly enough. The blade caught his side, drawing blood, and a howl of rage. He swung the revolver at her like a club, striking her shoulder. Pain radiated through her body, and she stumbled. Tobias knocked the knife from her grip. Desperation flared in her eyes as he clamped a hand around her throat, pinning her against the boulder. She gasped for air, her vision swimming. "You stupid ungrateful." Tobias's words choked off, when suddenly an arrow struck him from behind, piercing his upper back. He released Annabel with a strangled cry, whirling to see Chaitan standing on a ledge above them. Bow in hand, fury and disbelief warred on Tobias's face. Chaitan notched a second arrow, but Tobias lunged behind Annabel, using her as a shield. She clawed at his arm, struggling to break free. Tobias coughed blood, dripping from the corner of his mouth, yet he still pressed his revolver to Annabel's temple. He forced the jammed cylinder into place, trying to rotate it for a fresh shot. Before he could fire, Chaitan leapt down, tackling Tobias to the ground. The two men wrestled in the dirt, savage and raw. Tobias's wound bled profusely, while Chaitan fought with intense skill. Annabel scrambled away, breath heaving. She snatched up the knife from the ground, ready to intervene if necessary. Tobias managed to flip Chaitan onto his back, pressing the revolver under his chin. He pulled the trigger. Click. Another misfire. The gun jammed again. Tobias let out a strangled cry of frustration. Chayton seized the opening, delivering a swift blow that knocked Tobias's head backward. The cruel man slumped, dazed. Breathing hard, Chayton rose and stood over Tobias, arrow-knocked gaze cold. For a moment, Annabel wondered if he would kill Tobias then and there. She found herself trembling, uncertain if she could muster any pity for the man who had tormented her so viciously. But Chayton hesitated, perhaps thinking of what further violence might bring. Instead, he barked something in Sioux to the remaining hunter who had just emerged. Together they bound Tobias's hands with rawhide strips. The other man who had been ambushed lay dead or dying nearby, leaving the canyon stained with tragedy. Annabel stood there, chest-heaving tears streaking her cheeks. It was over, or at least this battle was. Tobias glared at her with undisguised hatred. "You'll pay for this," he hissed through bloodied lips. She stared at him. Raw rage mixing with heartbreak. "No." She replied quietly, "You will?" Chayton and the hunter escorted Tobias back toward the Sioux camp, ensuring he couldn't escape. Annabel rode alongside her spirit, heavy with a swirl of emotions, relief, anger, sorrow for the loss of life. She knew that legally he was still her husband, but morally he had lost any claim to that title. At the camp, Matto and the others learned what had transpired. The mood was solemn. Another man had died so that Annabel might be safe, and that weight pressed on her. Matto spoke with Chayton at length. They decided that Tobias would be delivered to the nearest army post, Fort Laramie, where he could face justice. Perhaps the soldiers wouldn't care much about an abusive husband, but Tobias had attacked a Sioux hunting party and murdered one of their own. That might hold enough weight to see him punished. Bound and wounded, Tobias was forced onto a horse. The group traveled to Fort Laramie. Under a wary truce, Annabel went along, feeling the need to face the final chapter of this ordeal. Upon arrival, the sight of armed soldiers and the bustle of frontier life overwhelmed her. Wordlessly, the Sioux hunters delivered Tobias to the commanding officer, explaining his crime. Annabel offered her testimony, shaky but determined. Initially, the soldiers eyed the Sioux men with suspicion, but after seeing the arrow wound and hearing the account of how Tobias had shot at them, the officer relented. He locked Tobias in a makeshift jail, pending further investigation. Annabel could almost feel the weight lifting from her shoulders as the cell door clanged shut. Tobias cursed her with every breath, threatening that he had friends in the territory that she'd never truly be free. But with each vile word, she saw a man undone by his own hatred and cruelty, powerless at last behind iron bars. It was in its own way a harsh karmic payback. Tobias's obsession with controlling her had led him to cross lines, even the frontier. Army would not tolerate. Now he would rot in a cell or meet worse for the crimes he had committed. Annabel watched him rage behind those bars, his face drained of color from blood loss, his eyes wild with fury. No longer did she fear him. She pitied him after giving her statement. Annabel found herself uncertain of her next move. She owned nothing in the territory, had nowhere to stay, and possessed only a few coins. The soldiers at Fort Laramie, while not hostile, made it clear they had limited resources for civilian strays. She wandered the post's dusty courtyard, feeling lost and adrift. Chayton approached, concern evident in his gaze. He spoke in halting English, offering for her to return with him, at least for a while, to the campsite where the Sioux had relocated. She hesitated, unsure of where she belonged. She owed them more than she could ever repay. Yet she also knew that life among the Sioux was not her own culture. Would she be an unwelcome outsider indefinitely? A gentle nudge from Chaitan's calm presence, the memory of the tribe's kindness, and her utter lack of alternatives swayed her. She nodded, eyes filling with grateful tears. Together they traveled away from the fort, forging a path back into the mountains. In the following weeks, Annabelle lived among the Sioux, healing both physically and emotionally. Though she still faced awkward communication gaps, she immersed herself in daily tasks, collecting firewood, learning to prepare meals the traditional way, helping care for the children. She found solace in the closeness of community, a stark contrast to the lonely terror she had known as Tobias's captive wife. She also discovered a blossoming bond with Chaitan. In his quiet strength, she recognized an integrity and gentleness that moved her. They spent evenings by the fire, sometimes sharing what words they could, other times simply enjoying companionable silence under the vast starry sky. She confided her past dreams, her fears, her regrets. He listened without judgment, yet she knew her journey wasn't over. The West was vast and held many possibilities. She could try to save enough money to travel back east, rejoin distant relatives, or carve out a life in another frontier town. But the taste of freedom had changed her. No longer was she content to let fate toss her about. She realized that for the first time she had a choice. One crisp morning, as the rising sun painted the mountain peaks gold, she confided in Chaitan that she wished to see more of the world to stand on her own 2 feet. He nodded, a wistful half-smile, tugging at his lips. She could sense that he'd grown fond of her, just as she had of him, but he wouldn't hold her back. He understood that a spirit, once caged, yearns to spread its wings. Before she departed, the women of the camp gathered around her in a small, impromptu ceremony. They offered her a finely beaded pouch, a symbol of good fortune and safe travels. Tears glistened in her eyes as she accepted it, feeling a deep gratitude for their acceptance and care. Matto wished her well, placing a hand over his heart in respect. And Chaitan stood quietly, his gaze reflecting mixed emotions. When she finally rode away on a horse, gifted by the tribe, she carried not just her bag of belongings, but also the lessons learned through pain and kindness. She carried the memory of a cruelty that almost destroyed her, and the image of a stranger's compassion that saved her life. Though the future was unknown, she rode forward with hope blazing in her soul. Wherever she went next, she would be free. Annabelle's trials in the rugged mountains transformed her from a fearful dependent bride into a self-determined survivor. Her journey proved that even in a harsh land, compassion can thrive, and cruelty will meet its reckoning. Tobias learned too late that brutality reaps a heavy karmic debt, one that locks men in cages, real or of their own making. Chaitan and the Sioux, though burdened by their own struggles with an encroaching world, showed that empathy transcends differences of culture and language. If you found Annabelle's story inspiring, please consider supporting this channel. Click like to let us know you enjoyed the tale. Share it with friends who love Western dramas, and subscribe to stay updated on more stories of courage and perseverance. Your engagement helps our channel grow, so we can continue bringing you thrilling narratives that celebrate the indomitable human spirit. Thank you for joining us on this Wild West adventure, and until next time, ride safe.